The arena was settling into a rhythm of comfortable predictability. It was the third hour of the show, and you could feel the energy in the stadium begin to plateau. 20,000 people were sitting in the semi-darkness, the blue haze of the lighting rigs catching the drifting dust in the air. The champion was in the center of the ring, holding a microphone, reciting lines that everyone had heard a dozen times before. It was a monologue about dominance, about being untouchable, about a kingdom with no challengers. The crowd offered polite boos, a low hum of dissatisfaction that felt more like fatigue than genuine anger. They were checking their phones. They were glancing at the exits. The narrative felt stagnant, like a movie where you already know the ending. In this moment of collective boredom, the atmosphere was fragile. It is strange how silence works in a place built for noise. There was a specific, heavy quiet hanging over the front row, the kind of quiet that usually signals the end of the night. But notice the screen behind the champion. For a fleeting second it flickered. Not a glitch, but a deliberate disruption. A single distinct heartbeat sound thumped through the massive speaker system. Thump, thump. It was subtle enough that half the audience missed it, thinking it was audio feedback. But the other half froze. That sound wasn't in the script. Champion stopped speaking, the microphone lowering just an inch. Confusion rippled through the ringside area. The security guards turned their heads toward the entrance ramp. The air pressure in the building seemed to drop, a physical sensation of something massive displacing the oxygen. The calm was not empty, it was heavy. It was the deep breath before a scream. The world was about to tilt on its axis. The lights didn't just go out. They were extinguished. Total consuming blackness swallowed the arena in a fraction of a second. The sudden removal of sensory input caused a gasp to rush through the darkness, 20,000 people inhaling at once. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. No music, no spotlight. Just the terrified murmuring of a crowd realizing this wasn't a technical error. Then a single spotlight snapped on at the very top of the entrance ramp. It was a cold, white beam cutting through the dark like a jagged scar. Standing in the center of that beam was a silhouette, was motionless, arms extended slightly, head bowed. The minimalist outline was unmistakable. You didn't need to see the face to know the posture. It was a stance of absolute confidence, a figure that had been missing from this canvas for 3 long years. A violin began to play a slow, mournful melody that twisted into something aggressive. The realization hit the crowd in waves. First, the front row saw the boots. Then the middle sections recognized the coat. Finally, the upper decks saw the name flash across the giant LED board in jagged red letters. It wasn't just a return, it was a resurrection. The sound that followed wasn't cheering. It was a primal roar of disbelief. People didn't just stand, they leaped. The sheer volume of the recognition created a physical vibration in the floorboards. The silhouette slowly lifted her head, the spotlight catching the determined glint in her eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just took one step forward, and that single step signaled that the era of peace was officially over. The ghost had returned to haunt the house she built. If you look closely at the footage, you can see the camera lenses vibrating. The cameramen, professionals trained to be steady as rocks, couldn't stabilize their equipment because the concrete foundation of the stadium was shaking. The noise was a physical wall, a solid force of nature that crashed down from the rafters. Commentary was rendered useless. He could see the announcers at the desk, their mouths moving, veins bulging in their necks as they shouted into their headsets, but no audio could penetrate the thunder of the crowd. They ripped off their headsets, realizing that speaking was futile. They just pointed. They became fans again, caught in the riptide of the moment. This level of mayhem is rare, transcends sport, and becomes mass hysteria. Fans were climbing over barricades just to get a closer look, held back only by the frantic wall of security. Grown men were crying, clutching their heads in disbelief. Strangers were hugging in the aisles. It was a release of 3 years of pent-up hope. The sound didn't taper off, it escalated. Every time she took a step down the ramp, the volume ratcheted up another decibel. It was a deafening feedback loop of emotion. The air was thick with flying popcorn, spilled drinks, and homemade signs being thrust into the air. It felt dangerous, in the best possible way. It felt like the building couldn't contain what was happening inside it. This wasn't a scripted segment anymore. It was a riot of joy. The anarchy was beautiful, a chaotic masterpiece painted in sound and fury, centered entirely on one woman walking slowly toward a ring that had felt empty without her. Contrast the chaos of the crowd with the absolute stillness inside the ring. The champion, who had been projecting an aura of invincibility just moments ago, was now a statue. The microphone slipped from her fingers, rolling across the canvas with a dull thud that no one heard. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the approaching figure. This is the storytelling power of body language. She didn't retreat, but she didn't advance. She was frozen in the realization that her reign, which had felt secure, was suddenly under siege. The champion looked at her title belt, then back at the ramp. You could see the calculations running through her mind. She had prepared for every challenger on the roster, studied every tape, planned for every scenario. But she hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't prepared for a ghost. The color drained from her face, not out of cowardice, but out of shock. The entourage standing behind the champion slowly backed away, instinctively clearing the stage. They knew they were essentially extras in this scene now. The ring, usually a place of crowded chaos, suddenly felt very large and very lonely for the one holding the gold. As the returnee reached the steel steps, the champion took a half step back. It was subtle, barely a shuffle, but the camera caught it. That half step told the entire story. It was the first crack in the armor. The predator had become the prey. The emotional weight shifted entirely. Champion was no longer the protagonist of the evening. She was the obstacle. The unspoken dialogue between them, one on the apron, one in the center, screamed louder than the 20,000 people losing their minds around them. While the arena was a storm of euphoria, the production truck was a submarine in distress. The director, usually the calmest voice in the chaotic world of live television, was shouting commands that overlapped into a frenzy. Cut to camera 3. Now give me the wide shot. Look at the crowd. Where is the audio? Kill the commentary feed. Just give me the ambient noise. The rundown sheet, the carefully timed document that dictated the flow of the show, was crinkled up and thrown onto the console. This segment was supposed to be 3 minutes long. They were already at minute 6 of the entrance alone. Monitors flickered with a dozen different angles of mayhem. The producer was screaming into his headset to the referee, "Don't do anything. Let it breathe. Do not ring the bell." They were flying blind. The script was gone. They were documenting history in real time, and the pressure was suffocating. Every camera operator was scrambling to find the perfect shot, the tear rolling down a fan's cheek, the trembling hands of the champion, the icy stare of the returnee. There is a specific kind of electricity in a control room when things go off the rails. It's a mix of terror and exhilaration. They knew they were capturing lightning in a bottle, but they also knew that one wrong button push could ruin the moment. The audio engineers were riding the faders, trying to prevent the equipment from peaking into distortion because the crowd noise was technically breaking their sensors. It was a masterclass in controlled chaos, a group of technicians trying to frame a hurricane. The red on-air lights seemed to burn brighter, pulsing with the heartbeat of the moment. Deep in the bowels of the arena, the locker room was silent. Usually, this is a place of loud banter, taping wrists, and warming up. But now, everyone was crowded around the small monitors mounted on the wall. Wrestlers, agents, and makeup artists stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glued to the screen. There was a complex cocktail of emotions in that room. For some, it was pure excitement seeing a friend return. For others, it was a cold dread. You could see the younger talent shifting uncomfortably. They knew what this meant. A return of this magnitude sucks the oxygen out of the room. It takes up screen time, takes up main event spots. The hierarchy of the backstage world had just been reshuffled in a matter of seconds. A mid-card wrestler whispered to another, "Well, there goes my spot on the next pay-per-view." It wasn't malice. It was just the brutal math of the business. The veterans nodded in respect. They understood the gravity of the reaction. They knew how hard it is to leave, to heal, and to come back to a reaction like that. But beneath the respect, the competitive fires were lighting up. Everyone in that room suddenly felt the need to step up. The bar had just been raised. The standard for over had been redefined. The locker room wasn't just watching a show. They were watching their own ecosystem change. The air backstage was heavy with the realization that tomorrow everything would be different. The comfortable routine was dead. The queen had returned, and everyone else was suddenly fighting for scraps of the spotlight. While the physical arena was shaking, the digital world was melting down. Within 30 seconds of her music hitting, her name was the #1 trending topic globally. Not just in sports, but across the entire internet. Clips of the entrance were being ripped and uploaded, garnering millions of views in minutes. The timeline was a blur of caps lock and crying emojis. It was a shared cultural moment, the kind that bridges gaps between casual viewers and die-hard fanatics. People who hadn't watched wrestling in a decade were texting their friends, "Did you see who just came back?" The server load on the streaming platform spiked so hard that the feed buffered for users in 3 different continents. It was a digital tsunami. The commentary team's shock was being memed instantly. The champion's terrified face was already being turned into a reaction GIF. But beyond the metrics and the virality, there was a deeper resonance. Fans were sharing stories of what this wrestler meant to them. They were posting photos of themselves as children meeting her, photos of action figures, photos of homemade signs from 5 years ago. The return wasn't just a plot point. It was a nostalgia trigger. It unlocked memories. It made grown adults feel like children again. The internet, usually a place of cynicism and division, was momentarily united in pure, unadulterated hype. The digital echo of the entrance was just as loud as the physical one, proving that her legacy hadn't faded during her absence. It had crystallized. She hadn't just returned to a ring. She had returned to the public consciousness with the force of a meteor strike. Cut away from the noise for a moment. Imagine a quiet living room, miles away from the screaming stadium. An older man sits in an armchair watching the television, sees the woman on the screen his daughter. He doesn't see the superstar, the empress. He sees the surgeries. He remembers the nights she called him crying because her back wouldn't stop spasming. He remembers the doctor's appointments where the word retirement was written in bold red ink. For the fans, this is entertainment. For the family, this is anxiety. He watches her climb the turnbuckle, seeing the slight hesitation in her left leg, a remnant of the injury that sent her away. He grips the armrest of his chair. He isn't cheering. He is praying. He knows the price of that adrenaline. He knows that every bump she takes tonight is a mortgage payment on her future mobility. There is a profound sadness hidden inside the glory of a return. To come back to the thing that broke you requires a specific kind of madness. The family watches with pride, yes, but also with a terrified understanding that she is feeding herself to the machine again. The roar of the crowd is intoxicating, but it doesn't heal bones. The television shows the glamour, the pyro, and the triumph. It doesn't show the ice packs waiting in the hotel room. It doesn't show the fear in the eyes of the people who love her, watching her walk back into the fire that almost consumed her. This perspective adds a haunting weight to the spectacle. Back in the ring, the music finally faded. The noise of the crowd settled into a buzzing hum, an electric anticipation waiting for the first spark of violence. She stood nose to nose with the champion. The height difference was negligible, but the presence difference was staggering. The champion raised the microphone, her hand trembling slightly. She tried to speak, to cut the tension with words, to reclaim her territory. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cracking just enough to betray her nerves. "This is my time. You left. You quit." The returnee didn't ask for a microphone. She simply stared. She looked at the championship belt resting on the champion's shoulder, then looked up into the champion's eyes. She reached out, her hand moving slowly, deliberately. The crowd gasped, expecting a slap or a snatch of the title. Instead, she gently brushed a stray hair from the champion's shoulder. It was a gesture of terrifying condescension. It was maternal, dismissive, and dominant all at once. She leaned in, close enough that the cameras couldn't pick up the audio, close enough that only the two of them could hear. She whispered something. We saw the champion's eyes widen. We saw the aggression melt into confusion. The returnee stepped back, smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned her back. She exited the ring without throwing a single punch. She left the champion standing there, physically unharmed but mentally dismantled. The psychological warfare had begun. The silence of her exit was louder than the noise of her entrance. As she walked up the ramp, stopping at the top to look back at the sea of humanity she had just controlled with a single look, the commentary team began to speculate. She's back for the gold. She wants her crown. That was the obvious story. That was the simple narrative. But as the camera zoomed in on her face for the final shot of the broadcast, something was different. She wasn't looking at the champion. She wasn't looking at the belt. Her eyes were fixed on a young girl in the front row, a child holding a sign that read, "I fight because you fought." The returnee touched her hand to her heart, a tear finally escaping. The twist wasn't a heel turn or a violent attack. The twist was the motivation. The next week, we would learn the truth. She hadn't come back to win the title. She had announced privately that this was a farewell tour. She wasn't here to conquer the future. She was here to say goodbye properly. She came back to put the champion over, to pass the torch, to ensure the kingdom survived after she was gone for good. The mayhem wasn't an invasion. It was a final gift. The explosion of noise was the fans unconsciously saying goodbye before they even knew it was the end. The screen faded to black, leaving us with the haunting realization that the brightest burns are often the ones just before the light goes out forever.